Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the incredible evolution of the Irish-American community in New York City. We're going to use the historical records to trace what is honestly a mind-blowing journey. It's a story packed with brutal hardship, fierce grit, and ultimately a staggering rise to cultural and institutional power. Really, if you want to understand the true fabric of New York, you absolutely have to understand this arc.
Let's kick things off with a pretty massive number. Right now, today, Irish Americans make up roughly 5.3% of New York City's entire population. Now, Boston might get a lot of the hype for having the highest percentage of Irish Americans, but New York City actually holds the crown for the most Irish Americans in pure raw numbers. That 5.3% makes them the second largest non-Hispanic white ethnic group in the whole city. But, they definitely didn't just wake up one day with this kind of establishment.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the dramatic flight from the famine. Second, we're mapping out those historic and modern neighborhoods. Third, we'll cover their massive impact on faith and first responders. And finally, the ultimate consolidation of power, politics, and pop culture.
Okay, Part 1, Flight from the Famine. Let's look at the massive wave of immigration that completely rewired the city.
Things escalated unbelievably fast over just a couple of decades. Community organizing actually started early. The ancient Order of Hibernians was formed way back in 1836 at a Manhattan Catholic church. But then, 1845 hits. The Great Hunger begins. This was a catastrophic turning point. Records show that by 1854, up to 2 million Irish had been forced to flee, arriving in cities like New York with basically nothing in their pockets. And all that immense pressure cooker stress, it eventually boiled over into events like the deadly 1863 draft riots, which, fascinatingly enough, historians say was almost like a mini-civil war within the Irish Catholic community itself, because rioters were violently clashing with police and politicians who were actually leaders from their very own neighborhoods.
The early days for these arrivals, absolutely brutal. They were the poorest of the poor in the city, literally packed into subdivided cellars, tiny attics, and dark alleys originally meant for just single families. But over time, the tide began to turn. Through sheer, relentless determination, they scraped together wealth, slowly clawing their way into better living conditions. And eventually, after 1945, you see this massive wave of upward mobility leading them straight out into the suburbs.
Which brings us perfectly to Part 2, Mapping Irish Neighborhoods. Let's see how that hard-won upward mobility literally redrew the map.
You can actually trace this economic rise geographically. Back in the day, the Irish were jammed into insanely dense, impoverished downtown spots. Think the infamous 5 Points, East Harlem, or Hell's Kitchen, where things stayed rough for a long time. But flash forward to today, it's a completely different story. You'll find high concentrations out in spacious, family-oriented outer borough communities, like Woodlawn Heights in the Bronx, or Bell Harbor and Breezy Point over in Queens. It is literally a living map of generational progress.
Now get this, because the contrast here is just wild. We just talked about the crushing poverty of those 19th century immigrants, right? Well, fast forward to the Celtic Tiger economic boom in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the dynamic did a complete 180. During this time, native Irish citizens were flying into New York on buying sprees, scooping up upscale Manhattan real estate as luxury second homes and investments. Talk about flipping the script on that original immigration narrative. All right, moving on to Section 3, Faith and First Responders. Let's look at the cornerstone institutions they built and dominated. Okay, before we get into the heavy institutional stuff, I have to share this because it's just brilliant. Yes, the Irish built massive educational foundations, places like Fordham and St. John's, but over at Manhattan College, there was an Irish immigrant administrator named Brother Jasper of Mary. He didn't just run things. He is actually credited with inventing the baseball seventh-inning stretch. To this day, the school sports teams are called the Jaspers in his honor. It just goes to show how baked into the city's everyday culture they really are.
Now, when it came to real structural power, the Irish built their foundation on two massive pillars. First up, the Catholic Church. They were the bishops, the priests, the nuns, establishing this gigantic network of parochial schools to keep their faith community rock solid. The second pillar, the uniformed services. Irish Catholic men flocked to the NYPD and the FDNY. And this wasn't just about grabbing a steady paycheck. This was a highly calculated, organized move to lock down stability, territorial control, and serious civic influence in their new city.
And, that deep-rooted connection to the police and fire departments created the classic Irish first responder image we all know. But that history is anchored in a very sobering modern reality. On September 11, 2001, out of the 343 firefighters who made the ultimate sacrifice, a staggering 40% were of Irish ancestry. It's a statistic that directly and tragically ties that 19th century search for a stable job right to the heroics of the 21st century.
To give you an even more personal sense of that legacy, just think about the number 200. After the 9/11 attacks, former police commissioner Bernard Carrick mentioned that during the recovery efforts at Ground Zero, they found 200 traditional Irish claddagh rings in the rubble. It is such a small, heartbreaking detail, but it speaks absolute volumes about who was standing on the front lines for the city that day.
For our final section, Part 4, Power, Politics, and Pop Culture, we'll see how this fully established community shaped the world around them.
This is absolutely crucial to understand. The Irish didn't just build these massive power structures and pull the ladder up behind them. When huge waves of new immigrants started pouring in from Southern and Eastern Europe between the 1880s and World War I, the Irish were already running the show locally. So, they used their grip on the church and local politics to bring these newcomers into the fold. They essentially wrote the playbook for Americanization, actively guiding these new arrivals through the incredibly complex process of becoming New Yorkers.
And honestly, their cultural footprint, it's everywhere, and it's wildly diverse. We're talking about a community that gave the city smooth-talking Tammany hallmares like Jimmy Walker. They produced legendary, razor-sharp entertainers like George Carlin and Conan O'Brien. They dominated globally with fiery athletes like tennis legend John McEnroe. And yeah, they absolutely left their mark on the gritty underworld too, with notorious street gangs like the Dead Rabbits back in the day, and the Westies much later on. They literally touched every single corner of New York life.
So we've traced this unbelievable arc, right? From starving immigrants packed into cellars to the absolute leaders of the city's most powerful institutions. But here's what I want you to think about as we wrap up this explainer. How much of New York's famous identity as a welcoming city of immigrants today was built directly on that foundation laid by the Irish? As brand new waves of people arrive in the city tomorrow, looking for their own upward mobility, are they essentially walking a path that was paved by the Irish blueprint over a century ago? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you're walking the streets of this incredible city. Thanks for hanging out with me for this one, and keep questioning the history all around you.